The second act of The Silver Shadow unfolded beneath a wash of silver light that transformed the familiar stage into something both ethereal and unsettling. The ingenious lighting design, achieved through a series of carefully angled spots filtered through gauze, created an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that seemed to hold the theatre in suspension between reality and dream. From his seat in the stalls, Inspector Alleyn observed how the company had adapted to the evening's earlier disruption, with professional grace. Though the absence of the authentic silver dagger had necessitated subtle adjustments in timing and gesture that only the most experienced eye might detect, Dame Millicent Carey moved through her scenes with the authority of decades spent perfecting her craft, while Rupert Fairfax commanded the stage with a magnetic presence that suggested genuine talent beneath his obvious "The Meridian Theatre," possessed that particular quality of hushed expectation that settles over London's West End establishments on the evening of a dress rehearsal, when the boundary between preparation and performance grows gossamer thin. Inspector Roderick Alleyn paused beneath the ornate Edwardian portico, observing the elegant stream of patrons ascending the carpeted steps into the theatre's warmly lit foyer. The building itself bore the confident stamp of theatrical prosperity, its cream-colored facade adorned with classical flourishes that spoke of an age when cultural patronage was considered both a social duty and a mark of refinement. Yet tonight there was something indefinably different in the atmosphere, a subtle tension that seemed to emanate from the very walls, as though the theatre itself were holding its breath. The foyer buzzed with conversation, pitched at that carefully modulated level that allows for both intimate discussion and subtle eavesdropping. Velvet seats lay in orderly curves like the plot of some well-made piece, their nap brushed in counterpoint to the aisles, while the faint sweetness of dust, rouge, and beeswax mingled with the discreet odor of damp wool from coats not yet surrendered to the cloakroom. Alleyn had accepted his friend Nigel Bathgate's invitation with genuine curiosity, rather than mere social obligation, intrigued by the critic's animated description of The Silver Shadow as either a triumph of theatrical archaeology or a potentially disastrous exercise in disturbing the dead. "Inspector Alleyn, how delightful that you could join us." Bathgate appeared at his elbow, with the slightly flustered air of a critic attempting to balance professional obligations with social courtesies. "I do hope you'll find the evening instructive." The play itself achieved a peculiar notoriety through its absence from the stage, having been abandoned 25 years earlier under circumstances that remain diplomatically obscure. Rather more drama behind the scenes than one might expect, even for a theatrical production. Near the grand staircase leading to the private boxes, a small circle had formed around a woman whose bearing immediately identified her as the evening's presiding deity. Lady Cordelia Ashworth commanded attention through the simple expedient of never appearing to seek it. She was a woman of perhaps 60, her silver hair arranged with mathematical precision, her evening dress of midnight blue silk cut with the sort of understated elegance that proclaimed both excellent taste and considerable expense. Her voice, as she discussed some point of theatrical interpretation, carried the authority of someone accustomed to having her opinions received as pronouncements rather than mere suggestions. "I'm afraid I must disagree with you there." "Gerald?" Lady Cordelia's voice rose slightly above its customary modulation. "The integrity of the original text must be preserved, regardless of contemporary sensibilities. Your father understood that principle when he first agreed to produce the play." The younger man to whom she addressed these remarks bore a striking resemblance to Sir Reginald Thornton, the theatre's distinguished owner, though his manner lacked the older man's comfortable authority. Gerald Thornton, the production's director, responded with barely controlled frustration evident in his voice. "Lady Cordelia, with the greatest respect, there are certain practical considerations that must be taken into account. The play as originally written presents difficulties that—" His words were interrupted by a new voice, crisp and unexpectedly authoritative, difficulties that were never properly addressed 25 years ago. The speaker was Vivian Marlowe, daughter of the play's original author, her dark hair swept back in a style that emphasized the intelligent severity of her features. Her presence seemed to challenge the theatre's very foundations, her tailored suit a stark silhouette against the pastel hues of the assembled company. "My father's artistic vision was never in question, Lady Cordelia. It was the circumstances surrounding the play's original abandonment that created the difficulties we now face. The silence that followed this observation transformed the casual social gathering into something approaching theatrical performance. On stage, Dame Millicent Carey, a grande dame of the British stage whose voice still possessed remarkable resonance, waited with the generosity of experience, while Rupert Fairfax, the ambitious leading man, moved with controlled grace that barely concealed his eagerness for stardom. Gerald Thornton wrung his hands discreetly at the edge of the stage, his nervous energy palpable as he attempted to balance the demands of his temperamental cast with the invisible weight of Lady Cordelia's expectations. It was during a moment of hushed intensity that a ripple of unease spread through the wings. A stagehand, pale and flustered, whispered urgently to the stage manager, Mrs. Blackwood, whose pencil hesitated for the first time that evening. The boy had been searching through the props table with mounting urgency, touching and retouching objects as if they might transform under his fingers. "The silver dagger for scene 2, Mrs. Blackwood said without looking up, her voice carrying with the peculiar authority of backstage commands. "It was here at the half." The polite music of the rehearsal faltered, ceased. Dame Millicent waited with professional patience, while Rupert's mouth set in a line of barely concealed irritation. In her private box, Lady Cordelia lowered her opera glasses very deliberately and leaned forward, her satin rustling like autumn leaves. "Is there a difficulty?" Her voice was delicate steel. "The silver piece? It is not a trifle, Mr. Thornton. The authenticity was insisted upon, as you are aware. Vivian Marlowe would not have it otherwise. Gerald." Thornton measured the moment with the diplomatic expertise of a man long accustomed to navigating the treacherous waters of artistic temperament and financial necessity. "A trifling inconvenience, Lady Cordelia. The prop for the stabbing is mislaid." Alleyn observed that the case, now standing open, bore very faint smears upon its latch where fingers might have been less than clean or nerves less than steady. The missing piece was not a theatre gewgaw, but an 18th-century dagger with a fine chased hilt, a piece one might encounter in a country house and feel inclined to slide into a locked cabinet. Lady Cordelia's gaze passed over Vivian, then Dame Millicent, and came to rest on Rupert as if testing each for voltage. "When one revives ghosts, Mr. Thornton, one must be prepared for a certain mischief. The Silver Shadow has always objected to substitution." Her words, though addressed to the director, seemed to encompass the entire cast in their pointed censure. The reference to ghosts hung in the air, a phrase pregnant with unspoken meaning that caused a visible shiver to pass through Vivian Marlowe. As the rehearsal continued with a substitute blade, the missing prop intruded itself like an absent guest whose rudeness could not be forgiven. Alleyn felt the temperature of the room alter by degrees, the elegant theatre transforming from a sanctuary of art into something that resembled a stage set for a different, more dangerous drama. When the interval was called, and tea arrived in fragile cups with thin curls of steam, Lady Cordelia descended from her box with regal authority. "My dear Dame Millicent," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, "you are admirable. How you contrive it with that boy is beyond praise." The comment carried the weight of decades of theatrical observation, while Rupert's bow in response seemed to seek approval that did not arrive. Lady Cordelia then drew Gerald Thornton aside, though not out of earshot of the attentive company. "We must speak privately when this is concluded. There are matters regarding the play, regarding my late friends, that I find I can no longer leave undiscussed. After the performance, "Lady Cordelia," Thornton agreed, his voice tight with apprehension. "After the performance." She turned slightly, allowing her eye to rest upon Vivian. "You, Miss Marlowe, will join us. It is time ghosts were dealt with." The statement, delivered with an air of finality, left an unsettling echo in the warming air of the foyer. As Lady Cordelia ascended to her box once more, her final words seemed to linger. "Some ghosts, I find, become more restless when one attempts to lay them to rest." When the house lights fell for the final act, the meridian was quite still, as if bracing for the next cue. In the hush between lights and action, Lady Cordelia raised her opera glasses once more, and the glass caught a thread of silver from the lamps, a flicker that, like a signal, vanished as the scene began. Alleyn, settling back into his seat with the missing dagger very much on his mind, reflected that theatres accumulated their own ancestries, threads running through seasons, knots where the old is tied to the new. He had no official reason to do more than enjoy the rehearsal, yet Lady Cordelia's curious speech upon ghosts and punctual reckonings pressed upon the tranquil surface like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples that would soon reach the shore. Ambition. The play itself proved to be a curious piece of theatrical archaeology, its dialogue bearing the mannered sophistication of the 1920s, while exploring themes that seemed particularly resonant in the current circumstances. The work examined the dangerous territory between appearance and reality, the price of maintaining elegant facades when truth threatens to intrude, subjects that Alleyn found himself contemplating with growing interest as the evening progressed. The substitute prop, wrapped in silver-painted leather to deceive the audience, served its purpose adequately, yet there remained an indefinable sense that something essential had been lost with the original piece, a quality that seemed to affect the very rhythm of the performance. In her private box, Lady Cordelia Ashworth maintained her vigil over the proceedings with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. Her opera glasses, delicate mother-of-pearl affairs that caught the stage lights with each movement, swept across not merely the performance, but the assembled company below, as if she were conducting some private inventory of the evening's participants. The box itself, with its crimson velvet upholstery and gilt appointments, seemed to isolate her from the common audience while providing the perfect vantage point for comprehensive observation. Beside her chair, a crystal glass of water remained untouched, and her program showed evidence of repeated consultation, its pages bearing the subtle marks of nervous handling. It was during the climactic scene of the second act, when the stage was bathed in that peculiar silver radiance that gave the play its title, that the first sign of disturbance appeared. A young stagehand, positioned to observe the precise timing of a lighting cue from a vantage point near the private boxes, noticed that Lady Cordelia had shifted position. The patron, who had maintained an almost rigid posture throughout the evening, had slumped forward slightly, her chin resting upon her chest in what might have been interpreted as the attitude of someone overcome by the evening's emotional intensity. Such reactions were not uncommon among sensitive patrons during particularly affecting theatrical moments, and the boy initially hesitated to raise any alarm. However, as the scene concluded and the interval approached, Mr. Pargeter, the house manager, decided to investigate. His concern stemmed not merely from solicitude, but from his intimate knowledge of Lady Cordelia's habits. She was not given to displays of emotion, theatrical or otherwise. He ascended the narrow carpeted staircase that led exclusively to the private box, each step muffled by the thick pile that had absorbed decades of discreet comings and goings. The staircase itself, hardly wider than a man's shoulders, admitted little light and carried the faint scent of camphor and orange peel that seemed to emanate from the very walls. At the heavy oak door, Mr. Pargeter knocked with the deferential discretion appropriate to his position. Receiving no response, he tried the handle and found it locked, an unusual circumstance, as Lady Cordelia customarily left her box accessible to staff for the delivery of refreshments. His master key, produced from the considerable ring that marked his authority within the theatre, would not turn in the lock. After a moment's consideration, he descended to summon assistance, his face bearing the grave expression of a man who sensed that routine concern was about to transform into something far more serious. Inspector Alleyn, already alert to the subtle shift in the theatre's atmosphere, met the whispered request for assistance at the foot of the stairs. His presence among the evening's guests had been noted by the management, and Mr. Pargeter's relief at encountering a composed gentleman who seemed equally capable of handling sudden difficulty or maintaining discretion was evident in his slight, formal inclination. The carpenter arrived with his toolkit, held like a ceremonial offering, his tools making only the most delicate protest as they persuaded the hinge pins to accept the situation. The door opened just enough to admit Mr. Pargeter sideways, and there followed a brief, entirely contained sound that might have been astonishment but was, of course, immediately suppressed. Lady Cordelia sat in her accustomed position, pitched slightly forward, as if transported by interest in the performance below. Her opera glasses hung suspended by their cord against the midnight blue silk of her evening dress, while her hands remained folded in her lap with the composure she had maintained throughout life. It was only when one's gaze travelled to the space between her shoulder blades that the true nature of her condition became apparent. There, protruding from the rich fabric with ceremonial precision, was the chaste hilt of the missing silver dagger. The weapon had been inserted with surgical accuracy, its 18th-century craftsmanship providing a grotesquely appropriate complement to her elegant attire. "Send quietly for Dr. Pembroke," Alleyn murmured, after the slightest of pauses. He had not moved beyond the threshold, recognizing that this was not a scene for trampling, and asked Mrs. Blackwood to hold the company. "They are not to disperse." He entered the small space with the carefulness of a guest aware of household rituals, his trained eye taking in the locked door, the shot bolt, the key that remained in Lady Cordelia's evening bag, and the absence of any sign of struggle. The positioning of the victim struck him as deliberately composed, almost theatrical in its precision, as if the killer had possessed not merely the nerve to commit murder, but the dramatic sensibility to transform the crime itself into a kind of performance. Dr. Pembroke arrived within minutes, his medical bag in hand, and his manner bearing the grave efficiency that such circumstances demanded. He was a man in late middle age, clean-shaven and slightly florid, with an air of being prepared to smooth away alarms through the application of common sense and respectable medicine. His examination, conducted with the discretion essential in such delicate situations, confirmed what the scene had already suggested. "There is nothing to be done," he said softly, after a moment in which the theatre seemed to hold its breath. "The heart has stopped quite recently, within the last quarter hour, I should estimate. The instrument has done its office without needless brutality." As word of the tragedy began to spread through the theatre with the speed of whispered rumor, the company gathered on stage with the stunned bewilderment of actors who had suddenly found themselves thrust into a drama far more serious than any they had rehearsed. Dame Millicent stood with her hand pressed to her throat, her professional composure momentarily shattered by the enormity of what had occurred. Gerald Thornton paced the boards with nervous energy, his director's instincts warring with human shock. Rupert Fairfax maintained his leading man's bearing even in crisis. Though his pallor suggested considerable effort rather than natural inclination, it was Vivian Marlowe who broke the stunned silence with an observation that sent a chill through the assembled company. "For the silver dagger," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the stage. "It's the authentic piece, isn't it? The one that went missing earlier this evening." Her words transformed what might have been dismissed as terrible coincidence into something far more sinister. The weapon that had taken Lady Cordelia's life was indeed the missing prop, returned to the production in the most macabre fashion imaginable. Alleyn studied the faces of the company, noting how each received this revelation, with expressions ranging from horror to calculation. The missing dagger's reappearance as a murder weapon suggested a killer with intimate knowledge of both the theatre's operations and Lady Cordelia's habits, someone who had planned the crime with theatrical precision and timing. The private box, with its locked door and apparent impossibility, seemed to mock the very foundations of logical investigation. Yet Alleyn had encountered such puzzles before, and knew that apparent impossibilities often concealed surprisingly mundane solutions. What troubled him more was the deliberate theatricality of the crime, the sense that he was dealing with a killer who understood the power of dramatic effect and was not above using murder as a form of artistic expression. As he prepared to begin his investigation in earnest, Alleyn reflected that the boundary between performance and reality had dissolved entirely within the elegant confines of the Meridian Theatre, leaving only the stark fact of violent death and the beginning of what promised to be a most unusual case. The killer moved among them still, hidden behind the same masks of shock and propriety that had concealed so many other secrets in this world where appearance was everything, and truth was the most dangerous performance of all. The green room of the Meridian Theatre possessed that particular mixture of faded grandeur and practical comfort that marked it as the true heart of theatrical life. Its walls, once fashionably green, but now softened to the color of autumn leaves, bore gilt-framed lithographs of past productions whose subjects gazed down with the benign authority of theatrical ancestors. An aspidistra of heroic proportions commanded the space beside the fireplace, its presence as essential to the room's character as the worn Persian carpet that showed the polished paths where generations of actors had paced in nervous anticipation. The air carried the mingled scents of grease paint, lavender water, and that particular mustiness that accumulates in spaces where human emotion has been concentrated and refined over decades. Inspector Alleyn had chosen this setting for his preliminary interviews with deliberate care, understanding that theatrical people often revealed more of themselves when surrounded by the familiar trappings of their profession. Mrs. Blackwood, the stage manager, stood with military precision beside a hastily arranged tea service, her notebook clutched like a weapon against disorder. Her cardigan bore the faint silver smudge that marked her recent handling of the missing dagger, and her manner carried the particular authority of someone who had spent decades maintaining order behind the controlled chaos of theatrical production. "If you please, Inspector," she began, her voice carrying the clarity that comes from years of making oneself heard over the din of scene changes and temperamental performers. "I have prepared a complete account of this evening's movements." The silver dagger was present on the property's table at half-hour call, 7:30 precisely. I marked it myself in indelible ink on the base of the stand. At 10-minute call still present. 5-minute call young Stephen reports it missing. Her pause carried the weight of professional catastrophe narrowly averted. The substitute was placed in Mr. Fairfax's hand immediately. I moved no one without cause, and the property's cupboard key has not left my possession. Dame Millicent Carey entered, with the unconscious authority of a woman who had spent 40 years establishing her right to precedence in any theatrical gathering. Her stage makeup had been carefully removed, revealing features that bore the subtle marks of a lifetime devoted to her art. Yet her bearing remained magnificent, despite the evident strain of the evening's events. She accepted a cup of tea with the precision of someone who had learned to manage props with theatrical grace, though Alleyn observed that her hands trembled slightly, a detail that would have been invisible from the stalls but was clearly apparent in the intimate confines of the green room. Lady Cordelia was a patron, in the finest sense, Dame Millicent began, her voice carrying the measured cadences of someone choosing each word with professional care. She understood that theatrical art requires not merely financial support, but intelligent appreciation. Her knowledge of our profession's history was quite remarkable, particularly regarding the earlier decades of this century. The actress paused, her gaze drifting toward the portraits on the walls, as if seeking guidance from theatrical ancestors. She had been making inquiries recently about certain events from the past, matters that some might consider best left undisturbed. I confess I attempted to discourage such investigations, believing that old sorrows serve no useful purpose when revisited. Gerald Thornton appeared in the doorway, with the nervous energy that had characterized his direction throughout the evening, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. His collar had become slightly disarranged, and his hair bore the marks of anxious fingers, yet he maintained the careful courtesy that marked him as his father's son. When Alleyn invited him to speak of Lady Cordelia, his words carried the complex mixture of gratitude and exasperation that often characterizes the relationship between artistic vision and financial necessity. The patroness was most particular about maintaining authenticity, Thornton explained, accepting tea with hands that showed a barely perceptible tremor. She insisted that every detail should reflect the original conception, from period costumes to antique properties. The silver dagger was her own contribution, an 18th-century piece from her personal collection. His voice tightened as he continued. Recently, however, she had begun to express concerns about the wisdom of reviving the silver shadow at all. She seemed to believe that certain aspects of the play's history might prove problematic. She wished cuts in Spectre of a sort that would alter intention entirely. She spoke of responsibility, of reputation, of shielding the public from what it was not ready to comprehend. Alleyn observed the interplay between the veteran actress and the younger director, with the attention of someone trained to recognize the subtle dynamics of human relationship. Dame Millicent's protective attitude toward Thornton was evident in her occasional glances, and the way she seemed poised to intervene should his composure falter. The director, for his part, appeared to draw strength from her presence while struggling to maintain professional dignity in circumstances that threatened to overwhelm his carefully cultivated authority. Lady Cordelia mentioned a conversation she intended to have after this evening's performance, Alleyn remarked, his tone carrying just enough inquiry to encourage elaboration without suggesting interrogation. She seemed to feel that certain matters regarding the play could no longer remain undiscussed. Dame Millicent's teacup clinked against its saucer with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. She had been researching the circumstances surrounding Thomas Marlowe's death, the actress admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The poor man took his own life just days before the original production was to open. Lady Cordelia seemed to believe that there were irregularities in the official account of his passing. She had discovered something among her papers, letters. Perhaps that bore upon his death. Into this charged atmosphere came Rupert Fairfax, still wearing his costume from the interrupted performance, but with his stage makeup removed, to reveal features that were perhaps more conventionally handsome than dramatically compelling. His entrance carried the calculated timing of an actor who understood the value of a well-judged appearance. Yet Alleyn detected beneath his polished exterior a quality of genuine distress that suggested the evening's events had affected him more deeply than his professional demeanor indicated. I must confess to having had words with Lady Cordelia earlier this week, Fairfax announced with the air of someone making a difficult but necessary admission. She had expressed reservations about my interpretation of the leading role, suggesting that I was failing to capture what she termed the essential tragedy of the character. She took exception to my rendering, and I took exception to her interference. We were both heated, Inspector. I left her presence with a bow that expressed regret without contrition. The revelation of this conflict hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that none of the room's occupants seemed eager to explore. It was then that Vivian Marlowe appeared in the doorway, her dark suit making a stark contrast with the softer tones of the other company members. She entered with a quiet that brought the room to attention, not through flourish but by a simple insistence upon the serious business at hand. "Inspector, I will be plain," she said, taking a seat without invitation and placing a folded paper upon her knee. "Lady Cordelia wrote to me a fortnight ago. She wished to meet privately about my father. She believed she had found something among her papers, letters perhaps that bore upon his death. Tonight she told me very distinctly that there were names in those papers, names of persons who profited by my father's ruin." Alleyn regarded the paper on her knee without requesting it, though he noted its careful folding and the way Vivian's fingers remained protectively near it. And what was to be the nature of tonight's discussion? "She proposed after the rehearsal to read me passages," Vivian replied, her self-control admirable yet brittle. "She believed, Inspector, that my father had been murdered, and she was determined to find out by whom." The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the soft hiss of the gas fire and the distant sound of the theatre settling into its nighttime quiet. Mrs. Blackwood, who had been standing with professional patience throughout these exchanges, now stepped forward with the decisive manner of someone who possessed crucial information. "Inspector, if I may," she said, consulting her notebook with the reverence of a scholar examining ancient texts, "there was something odd about the private boxes this winter. We had complaints of a draught near Box A that no man could account for. The carpenters laid it to old work behind the panelling. We placed a hanging to stop the complaints, but the draught persisted. It is an old theatre, sir, with passages and ways that even I do not know entirely." As if summoned by this mention of architectural mysteries, Mr. Pargeter appeared in the doorway, solemn and bearing a programme folded with the care one might accord a legal document. "If you please, Inspector," he murmured, approaching with the deferential gravity that marked his position as keeper of the theatre's more elevated spaces. This was found upon her ladyship's lap. There is a pencilled note. He held the programme open with steady hands, revealing 2 lines written in a clear, severe hand, "After Act 2, Box AR." The initial sat upon the page like a small, hard jewel refusing to declare its allegiance, while the words seemed to mock the very notion of appointments that would never be kept. Alleyn studied the note without touching the programme, his trained eye taking in the quality of the paper, the confidence of the handwriting, and the implications of the mysterious initial. The room had grown utterly still, its occupants frozen in attitudes of expectation and dread. Dame Millicent's eyes had gone to the aspidistra and remained there as if seeking comfort in its stolid reliability. Gerald Thornton's hands had clenched into fists at his sides, while Rupert took one involuntary step forward before arresting himself with visible effort. The green room, which had begun the evening as a sanctuary of theatrical tradition, now felt like the antechamber to a much older, darker drama, one whose final act had only just begun. In the silence that followed Mr. Pargeter's revelation, Alleyn reflected that the boundary between performance and reality had dissolved entirely within the elegant confines of the Meridian Theatre, leaving only the stark fact of violent death and the beginning of what promised to be a most unusual case. The killer moved among them still, hidden behind the same masks of shock and propriety that concealed so many other secrets in this world where appearance was everything and truth was the most dangerous performance of all. Sir Reginald Thornton's private office occupied a corner of the Meridian Theatre that seemed untouched by the passage of decades, its mahogany panelling darkened to the colour of old port, and its Persian carpet worn to silk in places where generations of theatrical luminaries had paced in contemplation. Her coal fire burned with steady propriety in the Adam grate, casting warm shadows across glass-fronted bookcases that held leather-bound prompt books, account ledgers, and theatrical annuals dating back to the theatre's founding. The morning light, filtered through tall windows that overlooked the narrow lane behind the theatre, illuminated motes of dust that danced above stacks of correspondence and photographs arranged with the methodical care of someone who understood that theatrical history required meticulous preservation. Inspector Alleyn stood beside the fire, ostensibly warming his hands, but actually observing how Sir Reginald, now approaching 80, handled the delicate business of resurrecting painful memories with the diplomatic skill of a lifetime spent managing artistic temperaments and public scandals. "I confess, Inspector, that I had hoped never again to discuss the circumstances surrounding Thomas Marlowe's death," Sir Reginald began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to being heard without raising his tone. He opened a leather-bound scrapbook with reverent care, its pages yellowed with age and heavy with pasted newspaper clippings whose headlines spoke of tragedy and scandal hastily contained. "The official verdict was suicide, and we saw no benefit in prolonging the theatre's association with such unfortunate publicity. One does not maintain a reputation by parading one's tragedies before the public." His fingers, though steady, betrayed a slight tremor as he turned the pages, revealing photographs of the original company in their youthful promise, their faces bright with ambitions that would soon be shattered by circumstances beyond their control. The scrapbook told its story in fragments: rehearsal notices filled with optimistic speculation, photographs of Thomas Marlowe looking intense and slightly haunted even in moments of apparent triumph, and then the abrupt shift to obituaries and carefully worded statements about the production's cancellation. Alleyn observed how the newspaper accounts, though respectfully phrased, carried an undertone of questions left deliberately unanswered, as if the press had been guided toward discretion by forces more powerful than mere editorial judgment. Among the documents, he discovered correspondence that revealed the playwright's increasingly desperate state of mind in the weeks preceding his death, his handwriting deteriorating from confident flourishes to barely legible scrawls that suggested a man under extraordinary psychological pressure. Dr. Pembroke arrived with the punctuality that marked his professional habits, his medical bag in hand, and his manner bearing that particular gravity that physicians adopt when called upon to discuss cases that have troubled their conscience across decades. At 65, he retained the florid complexion and robust bearing of a man who had spent his career ministering to the ailments of theatrical people, yet Alleyn noted a quality of nervous energy that seemed at odds with his usually composed demeanor. When Sir Reginald invited him to discuss his role in certifying Thomas Marlowe's death, the physician's response carried an undertone of professional discomfort that suggested old wounds imperfectly healed by the passage of time. "I was summoned to Marlowe's lodgings by his landlady, Dr. Pembroke explained, settling into a leather chair with movements that betrayed barely controlled agitation. The poor fellow was found seated at his writing desk, his head resting upon his folded arms, as if he had simply fallen asleep while working. An empty laudanum bottle stood nearby, along with what appeared to be a suicide note, expressing his despair at professional disappointments." The physician paused, his hands fidgeting with his medical bag's brass clasps in a manner that suggested the memory still possessed the power to disturb his equanimity. The physical evidence seemed consistent with self-administered poisoning, and the circumstances appeared to leave little room for alternative interpretation. However, as Dr. Pembroke continued his account, details emerged that cast the official verdict in a more troubling light. The positioning of Marlowe's body had struck him as inconsistent with the violent convulsions typically associated with laudanum poisoning, while the supposed suicide note bore handwriting that appeared steadier than one might expect from a man in the throes of final despair. These medical inconsistencies, combined with the haste with which the case had been closed, suggested that forces beyond mere administrative efficiency had been at work in shaping the official narrative. Sir Reginald's visible discomfort at these revelations indicated that the theatre's management had been more intimately involved in controlling the investigation's outcome than public records suggested. The arrival of Dame Millicent Carey transformed the morning's careful excavation of historical fact into something approaching dramatic revelation. She entered with the unconscious authority that marked her as a woman who had spent decades commanding attention through presence rather than announcement. Her morning dress of charcoal grey silk, perfectly appropriate to the gravity of the occasion, yet unable to diminish the magnificent bearing that had made her one of London's most celebrated actresses. When the conversation turned to her relationship with Thomas Marlowe, her response carried the complex mixture of professional respect and personal sorrow that suggested their association had encompassed far more than merely artistic collaboration. Thomas possessed an almost uncanny ability to perceive the hidden motivations that drive people to desperate acts, Dame Millicent explained, her voice carrying the measured cadences that marked her as someone who understood the power of carefully chosen words. In the weeks before his death, he had become convinced that several prominent members of our profession had built their reputations upon work that was not entirely their own. He spoke of systematic plagiarism, of manuscripts stolen and ideas appropriated without acknowledgement. Her hands, Alleyn observed, had begun to tremble slightly, despite her otherwise composed demeanor. He was gathering evidence, letters, financial records, documents that he believed would expose what he termed a conspiracy of mediocrity masquerading as genius. This revelation transformed what had appeared to be a straightforward case of artistic suicide into something far more complex and potentially scandalous. The suggestion that Marlowe had been investigating widespread plagiarism within London's theatrical establishment provided a motive for murder that went far beyond personal grievance, encompassing the destruction of careers and reputations built upon fraudulent foundations. Sir Reginald's face had grown pale during Dame Millicent's testimony, while Dr. Pembroke's hands had begun to shake with sufficient violence to rattle the brass fittings of his medical bag, suggesting that both men possessed knowledge they had hoped would remain forever buried. Lady Cordelia was among those he suspected of complicity, Dame Millicent continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, not as a perpetrator of theft, but as someone whose patronage had been secured through the suppression of inconvenient truths. He believed she possessed correspondence that would prove his allegations, documents that certain individuals would do anything to prevent from reaching public attention. The implications of this statement hung in the air like incense, heavy with the suggestion that Lady Cordelia's recent investigations had awakened fears that had been dormant for 25 years. Sir Reginald, perhaps recognizing that further concealment would prove futile, produced a rolled set of architectural drawings from a locked cabinet, their edges yellowed with age, and their surfaces marked with annotations in various hands. The plans revealed the theatre's hidden geography, service passages dating to its Victorian construction, forgotten spaces behind the ornate boxes, and corridors that connected public areas to backstage regions through routes known only to those intimately familiar with the building's secrets. Most significantly, the drawings showed a concealed panel behind the private boxes that would allow access without using the main staircase, providing a solution to the apparent impossibility of Lady Cordelia's murder. These passages were sealed in 1899 following a scandal involving unauthorized access to patrons' private areas, Sir Reginald explained, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had spent too many years protecting institutional secrets. However, Mrs. Blackwood recently consulted the plans when investigating persistent drafts in the box tier. The seals, it appears, had deteriorated with age, creating gaps that might allow a determined individual to move between spaces undetected. He indicated a corner of the plans where a section had been carefully removed, leaving a clean absence where crucial details might have been recorded. "I cannot account for this alteration, Inspector. The plans were complete when last I examined them." As the morning's revelations accumulated, Alleyn found himself contemplating the curious parallels between past and present tragedies. Both Thomas Marlowe and Lady Cordelia had died just as they prepared to expose dangerous truths about London's theatrical establishment, and both deaths had been orchestrated with a precision that suggested intimate knowledge of their intended victims' habits and vulnerabilities. The silver dagger that had ended Lady Cordelia's life served as more than merely a murder weapon. It was a theatrical statement, a symbol of how the past's shadows could reach into the present with deadly consequences. The office, which had begun the morning as a sanctuary of theatrical tradition, now felt charged with the accumulated weight of 25 years of carefully maintained deception. In the pale winter light that filtered through the tall windows, the dust motes seemed to dance with unusual agitation, as if the very air had been disturbed by the resurrection of long-buried secrets. Sir Reginald sat with his head bowed, the architectural plans spread before him like evidence of institutional complicity, while Dr. Pembroke stared into the fire with the expression of a man confronting the consequences of decisions made in youth and regretted ever since. Dame Millicent, who had maintained her composure throughout the morning's difficult revelations, now allowed a single tear to trace its way down her cheek with the precision of stage makeup carefully applied. "Thomas believed that truth was the only foundation upon which genuine art could be built," she said, her voice barely audible above the fire's gentle hiss. "He died trying to expose those who had built their careers upon lies and theft. Lady Cordelia died because she refused to let his sacrifice be meaningless." Her words carried the weight of prophecy, suggesting that the reckoning Marlowe had sought in life might finally be achieved through the investigation of Lady Cordelia's death. As the morning interview concluded, Alleyn reflected that he was dealing with more than a simple case of murder among theatrical people. The elegant world of West End theatre, with its complex web of financial dependence and artistic obligation, had provided the perfect environment for the kind of systematic deception that Marlowe had apparently uncovered. The conspiracy's tentacles reached into the highest levels of London's cultural establishment, binding together individuals who had spent decades protecting secrets that could destroy not merely careers, but the very foundations of theatrical respectability. The killer who had silenced Lady Cordelia moved among them still, hidden behind the same masks of shock and propriety that concealed so many other secrets in this world, where appearance was everything. And truth was the most dangerous performance of all. The fire settled with a soft whisper, sending sparks up the chimney like ascending souls, while somewhere within the theatre's ancient walls, a draught moved through hidden passages with a sound like distant applause, or perhaps, Alleyn thought with a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air, like the whispered approval of the dead for justice finally, inevitably about to be served. The private box, emptied of its tragic occupant, possessed in the morning light that particular quality of suspended animation that settles over spaces where violent death has intruded upon elegant routine. The crimson velvet walls, which had provided such sumptuous backdrop to Lady Cordelia's final evening, now seemed to absorb rather than reflect the pale winter sunshine that filtered through the tall windows overlooking the stage. The air retained the faintest trace of her distinctive perfume, something cool and expensive that lingered beneath the heavier scents of beeswax polish and the accumulated mustiness of decades. Dust motes danced with unusual agitation in a draught that seemed to emanate from no discernible source, while the opera glasses, returned to their hook by some serviceable hand, cast a small shadow against the silk-covered wall, like a reminder of eyes that would observe no more performances. Inspector Alleyn stood within the narrow confines of the box, with the unhurried attention of a man who understood that architectural details often held the key to apparently impossible crimes. Mr. Pargeter, the house manager, hovered in the doorway with the deferential gravity appropriate to his position, his morning coat immaculate, despite the extraordinary circumstances that had disrupted the theatre's usual routines. Sergeant Fox, broad and unassuming, examined the substantial lock with the patient methodology that had served him well through decades of criminal investigation, his experienced fingers testing the mechanism's operation, while his trained eyes searched for signs of tampering or unusual wear. The arrangements were quite specific. "Inspector," Mr. Pargeter began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to managing the complex requirements of distinguished patrons. Lady Cordelia insisted upon complete privacy during performances, requesting that the bolt be added to supplement the original lock some years ago. She carried the small key to the bolt on her person at all times, and I maintained the only other key to the main lock. He indicated the polished ironwork with a respectful gesture, his manner suggesting that such security measures were both reasonable and necessary in his world of theatrical proprieties. Last evening the bolt was shot from within. The door was therefore secured against entry from both directions. Sergeant Fox's examination confirmed the apparent impossibility of unauthorized entry through conventional means. "No marks of forcing, sir," he reported with the quiet authority of established fact. "The hinge pins were replaced this morning by the carpenter after we took the door for opening, but showed no scratches or tool marks. The lock mechanism operates smoothly, suggesting regular use and proper maintenance. If someone entered this box without Lady Cordelia's knowledge, they possessed either extraordinary skill or access to information not generally available to the public. It was while examining the rear wall of the box that Alleyn made his first significant discovery. The silk damask covering, though expertly hung and maintained, showed subtle signs of recent disturbance near the floor, where the fabric had been displaced by perhaps an inch from its original position. When he applied gentle pressure to the wall at this point, he detected a slight yielding that suggested the presence of space beyond the apparent boundary. The sensation was accompanied by that persistent draft, faint but unmistakable, that seemed to whisper of hidden passages and forgotten architectural secrets. Mrs. Blackwood arrived with her customary punctuality, bearing under her arm a roll of yellowed paper, and in her other hand the sort of carpenter's pencil that seemed never to have been entirely new. Her manner carried the particular gravity of someone who possessed information crucial to the investigation, yet her approach remained respectfully subordinate to the inspector's authority. "You asked for the original architectural plans, Inspector," she announced, unrolling the crackling paper with the reverence due to historical documents. "These Victorian drawings show the service passages and hidden ways that were incorporated into the theatre's original design. I retrieved them from Sir Reginald's locked cabinet this morning. The plans, when spread across the velvet seat of Lady Cordelia's chair, revealed the theatre's secret anatomy with meticulous precision." Alleyn traced with his forefinger the delicate line that ran behind the private boxes to a narrow corridor marked "Service Access," and thence to a small door giving upon what had once been the property storage area. Most significantly, a rectangle positioned immediately behind Box A bore the modest legend, "Panel, spring-operated," in the careful script of a Victorian draftsman. The notation suggested that the theatre's designers had anticipated the need for discreet access to the private boxes, though such passages had supposedly been sealed following a scandal in the 1890s. "The sealing was accomplished with screws and paint," Mrs. Blackwood explained, her voice carrying the professional certainty of someone who had spent decades maintaining the theatre's physical integrity. However, recent complaints about persistent drafts in the box tier suggested that time and neglect might have compromised those original security measures. "I had been investigating the source of these air currents when Lady Cordelia's death occurred," She paused, her expression suggesting that the timing of these investigations now seemed ominously significant, rather than merely coincidental. Alleyn applied his knuckles lightly to the rear wall, listening with the trained attention of someone who understood that sound could reveal structural secrets invisible to the eye. The response came not as one expects from solid masonry, but with a shallow hollowness that suggested the presence of space beyond. Further examination revealed that a brass fitting, apparently decorative, yielded to pressure with a resistance that felt recent rather than ancient. A loosened screw showed bright metal where paint had not properly settled, while the paint itself bore the clumsy sheen of hasty or repair work rather than professional restoration. Dr. Pembroke's arrival provided the medical expertise necessary to understand the technical aspects of Lady Cordelia's murder. The physician, though visibly shaken by the previous evening's events, maintained the professional composure that had served him throughout his career ministering to the ailments of theatrical people. When Alleyn requested his analysis of the wound, Dr. Pembroke's response carried the detached precision of medical training applied to tragic circumstances. The positioning of the blade suggests considerable anatomical knowledge, he observed, his voice taking on the clinical quality that medical men adopt when discussing technical matters that might otherwise prove overwhelming. The weapon was inserted with surgical precision, avoiding the ribs and penetrating directly to the heart. Death would have been virtually instantaneous, with minimal external bleeding and no opportunity for outcry. His hands, Alleyn noted, trembled slightly despite his otherwise composed demeanor, suggesting that professional detachment could not entirely shield him from the emotional impact of such clinical brutality. With careful pressure applied to the concealed mechanism, Alleyn succeeded in opening the hidden panel. The space revealed was narrow but sufficient to admit a determined individual, leading to a passage that disappeared into shadow in both directions. The opening disclosed not merely architectural curiosity, but a practical solution to the locked box mystery that had seemed so impenetrable. Fox's investigation of the passage confirmed that it provided access not only to Box A, but to the backstage area through routes that would allow someone familiar with the theater's operations to move undetected during a performance. One could pass through, certainly, if one knew the way, Mrs. Blackwood observed with the grudging respect of a professional acknowledging superior planning. The passage connects to the old property room, which has not been used for storage in recent years. However, the door to that room should have been locked, as I maintain all unused spaces in that condition. Her voice carried a note of professional affront at the suggestion that her security measures might have been compromised, yet the evidence before them suggested that someone had indeed gained unauthorized access to supposedly sealed areas. Fox's examination of the property room revealed that the lock had been recently opened with a clean key, its mechanism showing none of the rust or corrosion one might expect from long disuse. "Someone has been through here, sir," he reported with characteristic understatement. "The dust has been disturbed, and there are footprints leading to the passage entrance. The prints are too indistinct to provide useful identification, but they suggest someone of average height, moving with considerable care to avoid detection." As the morning's investigation progressed, additional evidence emerged that complicated the apparently straightforward solution to the locked box mystery. Caught in the faint nap of the carpet near the skirting board, Alleyn discovered a small fragment of paper, no larger than a postage stamp, browned at the edges with age as if torn from some older document. When lifted carefully on the blade of his pocket knife, the fragment revealed a single penciled letter, firm and unadorned, R. The discovery transformed Lady Cordelia's penciled note after Act 2, Box AR, from a simple appointment notation into something far more sinister, suggesting that the victim had indeed met with someone whose identity remained tantalizingly concealed behind that single enigmatic initial. The silver dagger, now confirmed as an authentic 18th century piece from Lady Cordelia's personal collection, bore traces that extended the investigation beyond mere architectural puzzles into the realm of personal relationships and hidden motives. The weapon showed not only the victim's blood, but microscopic traces of stage makeup and grease paint, suggesting that it had been handled by someone fresh from theatrical performance. Most significantly, the ornate hilt bore a small Latin inscription that translated as Veritas, Vincit Omnia, Truth Conquers All, a motto that seemed to mock the very circumstances of its employment as an instrument of murder. The technical solution to the locked box mystery, while satisfying in its logical completeness, raised more questions than it answered about the killer's identity and motivation. The crime required not merely knowledge of the theatre's hidden passages, but intimate familiarity with Lady Cordelia's habits, her personal possessions, and her recent investigations into the past. The precision of the murder, combined with the theatrical symbolism of using her own dagger as the weapon, suggested a perpetrator who understood both the practical and dramatic aspects of the crime with equal sophistication. As the pale winter afternoon began to fade, casting long shadows across the private box where Lady Cordelia had spent her final moments, Alleyn reflected on the curious transformation of an apparent impossibility into a grimly logical sequence of events. The locked box had indeed been impregnable from conventional approaches, yet the forgotten passages provided a solution that was both elegant and practical. The killer had moved through the theatre's hidden arteries like blood through a body, emerging only long enough to commit murder before vanishing, back into the architectural shadows that had concealed their approach. The discovery of the concealed passage explained the mechanics of the crime, but left its deeper mysteries intact. The how had been resolved through patient investigation and architectural archaeology, yet the why remained as elusive as the identity concealed behind that single provocative initial. The torn fragment with its solitary R seemed to mock the very foundations of logical deduction, offering just enough information to tantalize while withholding the crucial details that might lead to resolution. In the gathering dusk, as the theatre prepared for another evening's performance of more conventional drama, the private box stood as a monument to the deadly intersection of past and present secrets. The elegant space, designed for the appreciation of theatrical art, had become the stage for a performance far more sinister than any conceived by mere playwrights. Somewhere within the Meridian's ancient walls, the killer moved among the company with the same masks of shock and propriety that concealed so many other secrets in this world, where appearance was everything. And truth, despite the dagger's mocking inscription, remained the most dangerous performance of all. The fragment of paper, with its enigmatic R, lay like a challenge to justice itself, demanding that the complex web of relationships and motivations surrounding Lady Cordelia's death be unraveled before the curtain could fall on this most deadly of theatrical productions. The locked box mystery had been solved, but the greater mystery of identity and motive remained, suspended in the theatre's charged atmosphere, like the echo of applause for a performance that had ended in tragedy rather than triumph. Dame Millicent Carey's morning room in Belgravia possessed that particular quality of cultivated tranquility that marked it as the sanctuary of a woman who had spent decades transforming natural talent into artistic authority. The pale yellow silk walls, adorned with watercolor portraits of theatrical luminaries, seemed to absorb the winter light filtering through tall windows that overlooked a small, perfectly maintained garden. The scent of hothouse roses mingled with lavender and the faint mustiness of leather-bound volumes, creating an atmosphere of refined comfort that spoke of a life devoted to the higher pursuits. Yet beneath this carefully maintained serenity, Inspector Alleyn detected an undercurrent of tension that suggested the previous evening's tragedy had shattered more than merely the theatre's routine performances. The delicate spode tea service, arranged with mathematical precision upon a rosewood table, seemed to tremble slightly in the pale morning light, as if the very foundations of this elegant world had been disturbed by forces too powerful to be contained. By mere social convention, Dame Millicent received her, visitors with the gracious authority that had made her one of London's most celebrated actresses. Her morning dress of dove-grey silk, perfectly appropriate to the gravity of the occasion, yet unable to diminish the magnificent bearing that commanded attention through presence rather than announcement. She moved with the controlled precision of someone who had spent decades perfecting every gesture, yet Alleyn observed that her hands showed a barely perceptible tremor as she arranged the tea service, a detail that would have been invisible from the stalls, but was clearly apparent in the intimate confines of her private domain. When she spoke of Lady Cordelia's recent inquiries into the past, her voice carried the measured cadences of someone choosing each word with professional care, though beneath the polished surface lay currents of disquiet that suggested knowledge she preferred to keep concealed. Cordelia had become quite convinced that Thomas Marlowe's death was not the simple tragedy it appeared to be. Dame Millicent began, accepting her teacup with movements that betrayed only the slightest uncertainty. Her investigations had led her to believe that certain irregularities in the official account demanded closer examination. I confess I attempted to dissuade her from such pursuits, believing that the resurrection of old sorrows serves no useful purpose beyond the satisfaction of curiosity that borders upon the morbid. Her gaze drifted toward a silver-framed photograph of herself in a role from decades past, as if seeking guidance from her younger self. She possessed a formidable memory, Inspector, and a certain doggedness when she felt a principle was at stake. Once she had taken up Thomas's cause, nothing could deflect her from her chosen course. Gerald Thornton's arrival transformed the morning's careful discussion into something approaching immediate crisis. He entered with the nervous energy that had characterized his direction throughout the previous evening, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of a sleepless night spent wrestling with consequences that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. His collar bore the subtle disarrangement that suggested anxious fingers, while his eyes carried the haunted quality of someone who had discovered that the past possessed the power to reach into the present with deadly consequences. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm, which he clutched with the desperate intensity of someone protecting vital secrets, though his manner suggested that such protection might prove futile against the forces now arrayed against him. My father has been quite distressed by these developments, Thornton explained, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. He maintains that the matter of Thomas Marlowe's death was handled with the utmost discretion and propriety at the time. Any suggestion to the contrary would be a grave injustice to his long and distinguished career. His attempts to protect his elderly father's reputation were transparent, yet also tinged with a deeper fear that suggested he understood far more about his inheritance than he had previously admitted. Lady Cordelia had been pressing him with questions about certain financial arrangements that accompanied the original production. She seemed to believe that money had changed hands to ensure that particular aspects of the scandal remained concealed from public scrutiny. Dr. Pembroke's unexpected arrival provided the medical perspective that transformed speculation into something approaching certainty. The physician, though maintaining his professional composure, appeared visibly aged by the previous evening's events, his florid complexion having acquired a greyish pallor that suggested sleepless hours spent confronting the consequences of decisions made in youth and regretted ever since. He accepted tea with hands that showed a barely perceptible tremor, his manner carrying the weight of professional conscience wrestling with personal survival across the span of 25 years. When the conversation turned to his role in certifying Thomas Marlowe's death as suicide, his response carried an undertone of professional discomfort that suggested old wounds imperfectly healed by the passage of time. I have carried the burden of that verdict throughout my career, Dr. Pembroke admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The physical evidence was consistent with self-administered poisoning, yet certain details troubled my medical conscience even as I signed the death certificate. The positioning of the body, the steadiness of the supposed suicide note, the absence of the violent symptoms one expects from laudanum overdose, all suggested possibilities that I chose not to pursue at the time. His hands, Alleyn noted, had begun to shake with sufficient violence to rattle his teacup against its saucer, betraying the emotional cost of maintaining professional discretion in circumstances that had demanded moral courage. Lady Cordelia approached me several weeks ago with questions about my original examination. I felt in a moment of professional conscience that she deserved to know the full truth of my observations, however inconvenient they might prove to those still living. The revelation that Dr. Pembroke had shared his doubts with Lady Cordelia cast her recent investigations in an entirely new light, suggesting that her determination to expose the truth had been based upon more than mere speculation or historical curiosity. Dame Millicent's visible discomfort at this disclosure indicated that she had been aware of the physician's reservations, while Gerald Thornton's desperate attempts to maintain his composure suggested that the implications extended far beyond his family's reputation into the very foundations of London's theatrical establishment. The elegant morning room, with its atmosphere of cultivated refinement, seemed to grow oppressive as the weight of accumulated deception pressed upon its occupants like gathering storm clouds. Vivian Marlowe's arrival provided the crucial perspective of someone whose entire life had been shaped by the consequences of the original conspiracy. She entered with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades seeking truth in a world constructed upon carefully maintained lies. Her dark suit, making a stark contrast with the softer tones of the morning room's elegant appointments. She carried a red morocco portfolio tied with black ribbon, which she placed upon the rosewood table with something approaching ceremony, its presence seeming to charge the atmosphere with the promise of revelations that could no longer be contained or controlled. "Inspector, I have made a systematic study of my father's final weeks," Vivian announced, her voice carrying the weight of decades spent in pursuit of justice. "The correspondence I have assembled reveals a man under extraordinary pressure, yet determined to expose what he termed a conspiracy of mediocrity masquerading as genius. He had discovered evidence of systematic plagiarism within London's theatrical establishment, involving several prominent figures whose reputations would not survive such exposure." She untied the ribbon with precise movements, revealing foolscap pages covered with her careful annotations. Lady Cordelia possessed letters that would complete the chain of evidence, promises, inducements, threats. She had arranged to meet with me after last evening's performance to share these documents. The revelation that crucial evidence had been intended to change hands after the performance cast Lady Cordelia's murder in a new light, suggesting that the killer had acted not merely to silence one individual, but to prevent the exposure of a network of deception that encompassed some of London's most respected cultural figures. Helen observed how each member of the assembled company reacted to this information, with expressions ranging from horror to calculation, their carefully maintained composures beginning to fracture under the pressure of accumulated revelation. The red portfolio, with its promise of documentary proof, seemed to mock the very foundations of the elegant world in which they moved, where reputation was everything, and truth was the most dangerous performance of all. "There is something more," Vivian continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "This morning, when I went to Lady Cordelia's house in Eaton Square, I discovered that her writing desk had been forced. The maid insists nothing is missing, yet I know that Lady Cordelia kept the most sensitive correspondence in a red folder that she showed me just last week." That folder has vanished, Inspector, along with whatever secrets it contained. The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the soft tick of the mantel clock and the distant sound of London traffic. Yet the atmosphere in the morning room had become charged with implications that none of its occupants seemed eager to explore. Dr. Pembroke's teacup clinked against its saucer with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud, while Gerald Thornton's portfolio slipped slightly in his grasp, revealing papers whose edges bore the unmistakable browning of age. Dame Millicent sat with her magnificent bearing intact, yet somehow diminished, as if the weight of accumulated secrets had finally begun to tell upon even her formidable composure. From somewhere within the depths of the house came the sound of a door closing with unusual softness, followed by footsteps that seemed to hesitate before continuing along what might have been a corridor or passage. The morning room's tall windows, which had admitted such peaceful winter light at the beginning of their interview, now seemed to frame a world grown suddenly uncertain, where shadows moved with purposes that remained tantalizingly concealed. Alleyn rose from his chair with the unhurried grace that marked his professional manner, yet his trained eye had already noted the small details that suggested their morning's work had attracted attention from quarters that preferred to remain unobserved. "I believe," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough authority to command immediate attention, "that we are no longer alone in our deliberations." The words hung in the air like a challenge, transforming Dame Millicent's sanctuary of cultivated tranquility into something that resembled a stage set for a drama whose final act remained unwritten. In the pale winter light that filtered through the tall windows, the dust motes seemed to dance with unusual agitation, as if the very air had been disturbed by forces that moved through the elegant world of West End theatre with the stealth of shadows and the deadly purpose of those who understood that some secrets were worth killing to protect. The red portfolio lay open upon the rosewood table, its contents promising revelations that could destroy not merely individual reputations, but the very foundations of theatrical respectability. While somewhere in the house's hidden geography, footsteps continued their careful progress toward destinations that might prove as dangerous as they were unknown. The morning room, which had begun as a sanctuary of refined conversation, now felt like the antechamber to a much older, darker drama, one whose curtain was only beginning to rise upon the true, terrifying nature of the performance that had been playing out behind London's most elegant facades for the better part of 25 years. The auditorium of the Meridian Theatre lay in the hushed tranquility of late afternoon, its velvet seats arranged in perfect curves like the staves of some vast silent instrument awaiting the conductor's baton. A single lamp, the ghost light as theatrical tradition demanded, cast its pale circle upon the bare stage, while dust motes danced in the slanted beams that filtered through the tall windows overlooking the narrow lane. The air carried that particular mixture of mustiness and anticipation that settles over empty theatres, mingled with the faint scent of beeswax and the accumulated memories of decades of performances. Inspector Alleyn stood at the foot of the central aisle, his trained eye taking in the makeshift arrangement that had transformed the stage into something resembling a scholar's study. A mahogany table borrowed from Sir Reginald's office, upon which lay spread the accumulated evidence of 25 years of carefully maintained deception. Vivian Marlowe moved among the assembled documents with the quiet authority of someone who had spent years mastering the art of extracting truth from fragmentary records. Her black dress, severe yet elegant, seemed perfectly appropriate to the gravity of their surroundings, while her manner carried the particular intensity of someone who understood that the afternoon's work might finally provide the justice that had been denied for a quarter century. She handled each yellowed paper with the reverence due to historical artifacts. Yet her voice, when she began to explain the significance of her discoveries, carried an undertone of barely controlled emotion that suggested the personal cost of her long investigation into her father's death. The pattern becomes unmistakable when one examines the evidence systematically, Vivian explained, opening a leather portfolio that contained correspondence dating from the spring of 1925. My father had discovered that several prominent members of London's theatrical establishment had built their reputations upon work that was not entirely their own. The evidence suggests systematic plagiarism extending over years, involving manuscripts stolen from lesser-known writers and ideas appropriated without acknowledgement or compensation. Her fingers traced the careful annotations she had made in margins yellowed with age, revealing a network of deception that encompassed some of Britain's most celebrated theatrical figures. His play, The Silver Shadow, was intended not merely as entertainment, but as exposure, a dramatic revelation of the corruption he had uncovered. Sir Reginald Thornton descended the side aisle with the measured dignity of a man who had finally resolved to speak truths that had burdened his conscience across decades. His morning coat was immaculate despite the extraordinary circumstances, his bearing that of someone who understood that confession, however painful, offered the only path to redemption. He carried a manila envelope sealed with red wax, which he placed upon the mahogany table with something approaching ceremony, its presence seeming to charge the theatrical atmosphere with the promise of revelations that could no longer be contained or controlled. Inspector, I confess that I had hoped never again to discuss the circumstances surrounding Thomas Marlowe's death, Sir Reginald began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to being heard without raising his tone. He broke the wax seal with movements that betrayed barely controlled emotion, revealing documents that bore the signatures and letterheads of London's most prestigious theatrical establishments. We were protecting more than individual reputations, you understand. The scandal threatened to destroy public confidence in the very institutions that had nurtured British theatrical excellence for generations. His hands, though steady, showed the slight tremor of age and accumulated guilt as he spread the papers before Alleyn's careful scrutiny. Dr. Pembroke's arrival provided the medical perspective that transformed historical speculation into something approaching legal certainty. The physician entered with the grave dignity appropriate to such surroundings, yet his manner betrayed the nervous energy of someone who had spent sleepless hours confronting the consequences of decisions made in youth and regretted ever since. When invited to examine the evidence relating to Thomas Marlowe's supposed suicide, his response carried the weight of professional conscience, finally freed from the constraints of self-preservation and social pressure. The physical evidence was never consistent with laudanum poisoning, Dr. Pembroke admitted, his voice barely above a whisper in the theatre's scholarly quiet. The violent convulsions typically associated with such overdoses were notably absent, while the positioning of his body suggested a peaceful death that seemed at odds with the supposed method of suicide. The handwriting of the alleged suicide note showed none of the deterioration one expects from a man in extremis. His hands began to tremble as he continued, betraying the emotional cost of maintaining professional discretion in circumstances that had demanded moral courage. I was approached by certain individuals who suggested that a verdict of suicide would be preferable to the scandal that might result from more thorough investigation. They spoke of the theatre's reputation, of the fragility of public trust in our cultural institutions. The revelation that Dr. Pembroke had been pressured to falsify his medical findings cast the entire conspiracy in its true light, revealing not merely individual crimes, but the systematic corruption of the very institutions designed to protect truth and justice. Alleyn studied the correspondence that documented the conspiracy's scope, noting how certain letters bore the letterheads of London's most respected theatrical establishments, while others came from private addresses in Belgravia and Mayfair that suggested the involvement of society patrons whose reputations would not survive exposure of their complicity in fraud and murder. Lady Cordelia's role in the original conspiracy was that of someone whose social position and financial influence made her indispensable to the cover-up. Sir Reginald continued, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had spent too many years protecting institutional secrets. As a young patroness with access to private correspondence and social connections, she possessed the power to ensure that inconvenient questions were not asked, and uncomfortable investigations were quietly discouraged. She believed, I think genuinely, that she was protecting the theatre from scandal that would have destroyed not merely individual careers, but the public's faith in artistic integrity itself. Vivian's response to this revelation carried the complex mixture of understanding and condemnation that marked her as someone who had spent years trying to comprehend how decent people could become complicit in such systematic deception. Lady Cordelia approached me several months ago with evidence she had discovered among her late husband's papers, she explained, producing a red Morocco folder tied with black ribbon. She had found correspondence that proved my father's allegations beyond doubt, including financial records showing payments that could only be interpreted as bribes for silence and forged documents designed to support the suicide verdict. The documents revealed a conspiracy of breathtaking scope and audacity, involving not merely the theft of individual manuscripts, but the systematic appropriation of artistic ideas from writers whose social positions made them vulnerable to exploitation. Thomas Marlowe had been murdered, not for personal revenge, but to prevent the exposure of a network that had enriched some of London's most respected cultural figures at the expense of artists whose contributions had been erased from history. The financial records showed payments disguised as retainers and consulting fees, while the correspondence revealed the careful coordination required to maintain such an elaborate deception across years of public performances and critical acclaim. The silver dagger that killed Lady Cordelia was chosen with deliberate symbolism, Alleyn observed, his voice carrying the quiet authority of deductive certainty. The Latin inscription, Veritas vincit omnia, was Thomas Marlowe's personal motto. He had it engraved on several of his possessions as a reminder of his commitment to artistic truth. The killer understood not merely the practical requirements of murder, but the dramatic significance of using truth's own symbol as an instrument of silencing. The inspector's trained eye had noted how the weapon's selection transformed a simple murder into a theatrical statement, a macabre commentary on the price of seeking justice in a world built upon carefully maintained lies. As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the theatre's elegant interior, the weight of 25 years of accumulated deception seemed to press upon the assembled company like gathering storm clouds. The conspiracy that had led to Thomas Marlowe's death encompassed not merely individual crimes, but the corruption of the very foundations upon which London's cultural establishment had built its reputation. The elegant world of West End theatre, with its complex web of financial dependence and artistic obligation, had provided the perfect environment for the kind of systematic deception that could flourish only where appearance mattered, more than substance and reputation was valued above truth. Lady Cordelia's transformation from accomplice to threat was the catalyst for her murder, Alleyn continued, his voice carrying the measured cadences of logical deduction. Her guilt over her role in concealing Thomas Marlowe's murder had grown unbearable with age, particularly as she witnessed the continued success of those who had built their careers upon stolen work. The revival of the Silver Shadow served as a powerful reminder of the injustice she had helped perpetuate, driving her to seek the redemption that could only come through full disclosure of the truth. Dr. Pembroke's final revelation completed the picture of collective guilt that had bound the conspirators together across decades of carefully maintained silence. Lady Cordelia intended to present her evidence to the authorities after last evening's performance, he confessed, his voice carrying the weight of professional conscience finally freed from the constraints of fear and self-preservation. She had arranged to meet with representatives from Scotland Yard this morning to discuss the reopening of Thomas Marlowe's case. Her murder was not merely the silencing of an inconvenient witness, but the desperate act of someone who understood. That exposure would mean not merely personal ruin, but the collapse of reputations that had been built upon foundations of fraud and theft. The ghost light flickered slightly, casting dancing shadows across the assembled evidence that seemed to give life to the yellowed documents spread upon the mahogany table. From somewhere within the theatre's ancient structure came the soft sound of settling timber and the whisper of air moving through hidden passages, as if the building itself were sighing under the weight of secrets finally brought to light. The red morocco folder lay open like a wound, its contents revealing the systematic betrayal of artistic principles that were supposed to govern London's cultural life, a betrayal that had been protected by the same elegant facades that concealed so many other secrets. In this world where appearance was everything and truth remained the most dangerous performance of all, Sir Reginald sat with his head bowed. The architectural plans of deception spread before him like evidence of institutional complicity, while Dr. Pembroke stared into the theatre's shadows with the expression of a man confronting the consequences of decisions made in youth and regretted ever since. Vivian Marlowe, who had maintained her composure throughout the afternoon's difficult revelations, now allowed a single tear to trace its way down her cheek, with the precision of stage makeup carefully applied. The theatre, which had begun the day as a sanctuary of artistic tradition, now felt charged with the accumulated weight of 25 years of carefully maintained deception. While somewhere within its elegant confines, the killer who had silenced Lady Cordelia moved among colleagues and friends with the same careful discretion that had concealed far greater crimes the afternoon's revelations had exposed. The why of Lady Cordelia's murder with devastating clarity, yet the who remained tantalizingly concealed behind the same masks of respectability that had protected the original conspirators. The weight of 25 years pressed upon the theatre's charged atmosphere, like the echo of applause for a performance that had ended in tragedy rather than triumph, while the ghostlight continued its faithful vigil over secrets that had finally been brought into the harsh illumination of justice. The silver dagger's mocking inscription, "Truth conquers all," seemed to echo through the gathering dusk, a challenge to the very foundations of a world built upon carefully maintained lies and the systematic suppression of inconvenient truths. As the shadows lengthened and the theatre prepared to close for the evening, Alleyn reflected that he was dealing with more than a simple case of murder among theatrical people. The conspiracy that had claimed both Thomas Marlowe and Lady Cordelia represented a systematic betrayal of the artistic principles that were supposed to govern civilized society, a betrayal that had been protected by the very institutions designed to nurture and preserve cultural excellence. The killer moved among them still, hidden behind the same elegant facades that concealed so many other secrets, protected by a network of mutual dependence and shared guilt that had made both the original conspiracy and its deadly consequences inevitable. The curtain was finally rising on the truth, yet the final act of this most deadly of theatrical productions remained unwritten, its conclusion suspended in the theatre's charged atmosphere, like the promise of justice finally, inevitably about to be served. The grand foyer of the Meridian Theatre had been transformed into something resembling the drawing room of a country house where the final revelations of a particularly complex mystery might unfold with appropriate dignity. The marble columns, draped with shadows cast by crystal chandeliers, dimmed to half their usual brilliance, created an atmosphere of hushed expectation that seemed to charge the very air with theatrical possibility. Mr. Pargeter had arranged the furniture with ceremonial precision. High-backed chairs positioned in a careful semicircle around the ornate fireplace, where a coal fire burned with steady propriety despite the mildness of the evening. The Persian carpets, normally deployed to guide patrons toward the auditorium, had been repositioned to create an intimate stage where truth might finally claim its long-delayed performance. Inspector Alleyn stood with his back to the mantelpiece, his evening dress impeccable despite the extraordinary circumstances, his bearing that of someone who understood that the resolution of complex crimes required not merely logical deduction, but a certain theatrical sensibility that could transform revelation into art. The assembled company had gathered with the reluctant dignity of actors summoned for the final rehearsal of a play they would prefer never to perform. Dame Millicent Carey occupied the position of honor, in a chair that seemed almost throne-like in its carved magnificence, her black silk evening dress perfectly appropriate to the gravity of the occasion, yet unable to diminish the bearing that had commanded London's stages for 4 decades. Her hands, folded in her lap with characteristic precision, showed only the slightest tremor, a detail that would have been invisible from the stalls, but was clearly apparent in the intimate confines of this makeshift tribunal. Gerald Thornton stood near the tall windows that overlooked the lane, his nervous energy barely contained by the formal constraints of evening dress, while his father, Sir Reginald, sat with the measured dignity of someone who had finally resolved to hear truths that would inevitably destroy the carefully constructed world he had spent a lifetime protecting. Dr. Pembroke entered the foyer with the grave composure that had marked his professional demeanor throughout his career, yet Alleyn observed that his florid complexion had acquired a greyish pallor that suggested sleepless hours spent confronting consequences that could no longer be deferred. He carried his medical bag with the unconscious precision of decades of practice, though his hands showed a barely perceptible tremor as he accepted a crystal glass of brandy from the sideboard. Rupert Fairfax positioned himself near a marble pillar with the calculated grace of someone who understood staging, while Vivian Marlowe sat with quiet intensity, her dark evening dress making a stark contrast with the warmer tones of the foyer's elegant appointments. Mrs. Blackwood and Mr. Pargeter stood respectfully near the entrance, silent witnesses to what promised to be the most extraordinary performance in the theatre's distinguished history. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alleyn began, his voice carrying the measured authority that had served him throughout his career in circumstances where logic must be transformed into narrative comprehensible to minds strained by shock and accumulated guilt. "We gather this evening to discuss the death of Lady Cordelia Ashworth, yet we cannot properly understand that tragedy without first examining the events of 25 years ago that made it inevitable. The murder of Thomas Marlowe in 1925 was not the simple suicide it appeared to be, but rather the culmination of a conspiracy that encompassed some of London's most respected cultural institutions." He paused, allowing his gaze to rest briefly on each member of the assembled company, noting how they received this opening statement with expressions ranging from resignation to barely controlled terror. The conspiracy that led to Thomas Marlowe's death was motivated not by personal animosity but by the systematic theft of artistic property that had enriched several prominent members of London's theatrical establishment, Alleyn continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority of deductive certainty. Marlowe had discovered evidence of plagiarism extending over years, involving manuscripts stolen from lesser-known writers and ideas appropriated without acknowledgement or compensation. His play, The Silver Shadow, was intended not merely as entertainment but as exposure, a dramatic revelation of the corruption he had uncovered. When he threatened to present this evidence publicly, He was murdered to ensure his silence, and his death was disguised as suicide through the complicity of those who had most to lose from his revelations. The foyer's elegant atmosphere seemed to grow oppressive as the weight of these accusations settled upon the assembled company. Dame Millicent's magnificent composure began to show signs of strain, while Gerald Thornton's attempts to maintain his professional dignity collapsed entirely under the pressure of implications that threatened to destroy not merely individual reputations but the very foundations of his family's theatrical legacy. The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across faces that showed the accumulated strain of secrets finally brought to light, while the Persian carpets seemed to absorb the whispered admissions and half-stifled sobs that marked the collapse of a world built upon systematic betrayal. Cordelia's transformation from accomplice to threat was the catalyst for her murder, Alleyn observed, his trained eye noting how each member of the company reacted to this statement with varying degrees of comprehension and horror. Her guilt over her role in concealing Thomas Marlowe's death had grown unbearable with age, particularly as she witnessed the continued success of those who had built their careers upon stolen work. The revival of the Silver Shadow served as a powerful reminder of the injustice she had helped perpetuate, driving her to seek the redemption that could only come through full disclosure of the truth. He moved slightly, his position allowing him to observe the entire company while maintaining the theatrical authority that the moment demanded. The technical aspects of Lady Cordelia's murder initially presented us with what appeared to be an impossible crime. Her private box was locked from within, accessible only by a narrow staircase that was under constant observation. However, the theatre itself, with its forgotten passages and concealed ways, provided the solution to this apparent impossibility. The hidden panel behind Box A, compromised by age and neglect, allowed someone intimately familiar with the building's secret geography to enter undetected, commit murder, and withdraw without using the conventional approach. Dr. Pembroke's medical bag slipped slightly in his grasp, the brass fittings catching the firelight with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the charged atmosphere. His professional composure, maintained throughout decades of practice, finally began to crack under the weight of Alleyn's methodical exposition, revealing beneath the polished exterior a man who had carried the burden of terrible knowledge for 25 years. The weapon, Lady Cordelia's own 18th-century silver dagger, bore a Latin inscription that provided the key to understanding both the crime's practical and symbolic dimensions, Alleyn continued, producing the evidence bag that contained the ornate blade. Veritas vincit omnia, truth conquers all, was Thomas Marlowe's personal motto engraved upon several of his possessions as a reminder of his commitment to artistic integrity. The killer's choice of this particular weapon transformed a simple murder into a theatrical statement, a macabre commentary on the price of seeking justice in a world built upon carefully maintained lies. The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by Dame Millicent's barely audible intake of breath, as if the very air had been charged with the electricity of truth finally, inevitably brought to light. The inspector's gaze came to rest upon Dr. Pembroke, whose medical expertise and intimate knowledge of the theatre's operations had made him uniquely qualified to commit the perfect crime. The individual who provided the crucial medical certification of Thomas Marlowe's death as suicide, despite profound professional doubts about the physical evidence, was Dr. Pembroke, Alleyn announced, his voice carrying the weight of inevitable revelation. The positioning of Marlowe's body was inconsistent with laudanum poisoning. The supposed suicide note showed none of the deterioration expected from a man in extremis, and the circumstances surrounding the discovery suggested murder rather than self-destruction. Yet Dr. Pembroke certified the death as suicide, not merely to protect his own reputation, but to shield others whose careers would not have survived the scandal of association With systematic plagiarism and fraud, Dr. Pembroke rose from his chair with movements that suggested the weight of decades pressing upon his shoulders, his medical bag clutched in hands that no longer attempted to disguise their trembling. The florid complexion that had marked him as a man of robust health had given way to an ashen pallor that spoke of sleepless nights and the gradual erosion of a conscience that could no longer bear the burden of accumulated deception. Your motive, Dr. Pembroke, encompassed both self-preservation and something far more complex. A desperate attempt to protect someone whose artistic achievements you valued above your own professional integrity, Alleyn continued, his voice softened by a note of understanding that acknowledged the tragic nobility of misguided love. So you have harbored a deep and enduring affection for Dame Millicent Carey since your youth, an affection you chose to keep secret, sacrificing your own happiness for her career and reputation. When Lady Cordelia's investigations threatened to expose the full scope of the original conspiracy, including Dame Millicent's association with Thomas Marlowe, you acted to prevent the destruction of everything you had spent a lifetime protecting. Dame Millicent's eyes, which had remained fixed upon some distant point throughout the evening's revelations, now turned toward Dr. Pembroke with an expression that combined dawning horror with profound sorrow. The recognition of a secret affection that had spanned decades and culminated in this tragic, public revelation seemed to age her visibly, transforming the magnificent actress into a woman confronting the devastating cost of secrets maintained too long. The red folder containing Lady Cordelia's most incriminating documents was not merely misplaced. From her writing desk, Alleyn concluded, his voice firm with the authority of complete certainty. It was removed by you, Dr. Pembroke, after you murdered her, in a desperate attempt to destroy evidence that would have implicated both yourself and Dame Millicent in the wider scandal. The R on her program was indeed your initial, not as a guest, but as the one who had agreed to meet her, the one who then silenced her with the very symbol of the truth she sought to restore. Dr. Pembroke's confession, when it came, was delivered with the quiet dignity of a man who had finally found peace in the acknowledgement of terrible truths. She would have destroyed everything, he whispered, his voice carrying across the hushed foyer with the clarity of complete honesty. Everything that mattered to Millicent, everything that gave meaning to a life devoted to art. I couldn't allow it, Inspector. Not after all these years of watching her create beauty in a world that had already taken so much from her. His gaze sought Dame Millicent's face, finding there not forgiveness, but a profound understanding of the price that love, when twisted by circumstance and time, could exact from those who valued others' happiness above their own moral certainty. The grand foyer, which had begun the evening as a sanctuary of theatrical elegance, now felt charged with the accumulated weight of 25 years of carefully maintained deception finally brought to light. The crystal chandeliers seemed to tremble slightly in their mountings, as if the very foundations of the elegant world they illuminated had been shaken by revelations that could no longer be contained or controlled. From somewhere within the theatre's ancient structure came the soft whisper of air moving through hidden passages, while the ghost light on the distant stage flickered like a beacon calling the living to account for the debts owed to the dead. The silver dagger, that elegant and fatal instrument, lay in its evidence bag like a challenge to the very notion that truth could be permanently suppressed. Its mocking inscription, "Truth conquers all," finally vindicated through the patient work of justice methodically applied. The curtain had fallen on Lady Cordelia Ashworth's life, and on Dr. Pembroke's long career of service and secret devotion, but the final act of this most deadly of theatrical productions had achieved the catharsis that Thomas Marlowe had sought in his original conception of the Silver Shadow, the triumph of truth over the elegant facades that concealed systematic corruption, and the restoration of justice to a world where appearance had mattered more than substance for far too long. In the profound silence that followed Dr. Pembroke's confession, As Sergeant Fox stepped forward with the quiet efficiency that marked the conclusion of even the most complex investigations, the assembled company seemed to understand that they had witnessed not merely the solution to a murder, but the final performance of a drama that had been playing out behind London's most elegant facades for the better part of 25 years. The Meridian Theatre, with its hidden passages and forgotten secrets, had provided the perfect stage for both crime and revelation, while the silver dagger, that symbol of truth's ultimate victory, would serve as a reminder that some debts to justice, however long deferred, must eventually be paid in full. A fine mist had settled over the narrow lane behind the Meridian Theatre, transforming the familiar Georgian facades into something ethereal and insubstantial, as if the very foundations of London's theatrical quarter had been called into question by the previous evening's revelations. The theatre itself stood with its doors closed to the public, its elegant portico bearing a discreet notice that performances had been suspended indefinitely pending further arrangements. Within the building, the silence possessed that particular quality of aftermath that settles over spaces where great dramas have concluded, leaving only the echo of applause that would never sound again, and the lingering scent of secrets finally exhaled into the cold morning air. Inspector Alleyn moved through these hushed corridors with the reflective manner of someone who understood that the true performance often began only when the official curtain had descended. Observing how the surviving members of the company dealt with the collapse of their carefully constructed world. Dame Millicent Carey's dressing room, usually a vibrant sanctuary of theatrical preparation, now felt like a shrine to a career that had ended not in triumph, but in the devastating exposure of truths too long concealed. She sat before her illuminated mirror, not applying the elaborate makeup that had transformed her into countless characters, but simply gazing at her reflection with the profound weariness of someone who had finally ceased to perform. Her morning dress of deepest black silk was appropriate to morning, yet it could not diminish the magnificent bearing that had commanded London's stages for 4 decades. When she spoke of Dr. Pembroke's arrest and her decision to retire from the theatre, her voice carried the measured cadences of classical tragedy, as if she understood that her life had become the very sort of drama she had spent decades interpreting for others. Poor Arthur believed he was protecting me. "Inspector," Dame Millicent said, her words carrying the weight of decades of unspoken understanding. To have carried such devotion in secret, to have sacrificed his professional integrity for what he imagined was my welfare. It is a tragedy worthy of the greatest playwrights, yet one I would gladly have remained ignorant of if it could have prevented such desperate measures. Her gaze drifted toward a silver-framed photograph of herself in a role from years past, as if seeking guidance from her younger self. "My retirement is not merely professional necessity, but personal recognition that some performances, however skillfully maintained, exact too high a price from those who love us most." Gerald Thornton appeared in the doorway with the subdued energy of someone who had spent sleepless hours contemplating the salvage of institutional reputation from the wreckage of family scandal. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain, yet his manner carried a new determination that suggested the younger generation's resolve to build upon foundations of truth rather than elegant deception. He bore a leather portfolio containing correspondence from the theatre's Board of Governors. Their urgent deliberations focused on whether the Meridian could survive revelations that had shaken public confidence in London's most respected cultural institutions. "The board has voted to continue operations, Inspector, though under significantly altered circumstances," Thornton announced, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "My father's resignation has been accepted with appropriate discretion, while new management structures will ensure transparency in all future artistic and financial decisions." His attempts to maintain professional composure were undermined by the obvious strain of trying to preserve something from the collapse of everything his family had devoted their lives to protecting. The revival of The Silver Shadow has been cancelled permanently, yet we hope that Thomas Marlowe's other works might eventually receive the recognition they deserve, performed with the integrity their author demanded. Vivian Marlowe entered with the quiet dignity that had marked her throughout the investigation, her dark suit making a stark contrast with the theatrical finery that surrounded them. She carried a small bouquet of white carnations, which she placed beside Dame Millicent's mirror, with a gesture that seemed to acknowledge both the victim and the ultimate vindication of her father's memory. Her voice, when she spoke of the investigation's conclusion, carried a note of profound sadness that suggested victory over injustice could exact its own emotional toll, leaving behind not triumph, but a melancholy understanding of human frailty and the terrible cost of secrets maintained too long. Lady Cordelia's death has finally provided my father with the justice that was denied him in life, Vivian observed, her words carrying the complex mixture of satisfaction and sorrow that marked the conclusion of a 25-year quest. Yet I cannot help but reflect that Dr. Pembroke's misguided devotion has created new victims, new tragedies that might have been avoided through earlier honesty rather than continued deception. She paused, her gaze taking in the dressing room that had witnessed so many transformations from private person to public performer. The conspiracy that claimed both my father and Lady Cordelia encompassed not merely individual crimes, but the systematic corruption of artistic principles that were supposed to govern our cultural institutions. Mrs. Blackwood appeared with her customary efficiency, though her manner carried the subdued quality of someone managing institutional dissolution rather than preparing for future performances. She bore a clipboard containing the practical details of disbanding a theatrical company, contracts terminated, properties returned, and the thousand small arrangements that marked the difference between temporary closure and permanent transformation. Her professional competence, which had maintained order through decades of theatrical chaos, now served to document the systematic reorganization of everything she had devoted her career to preserving. The company's immediate obligations have been fulfilled, Mrs. Blackwood reported with characteristic precision. The remaining staff will be retained to manage the building's transition to new management, while arrangements have been made for the proper disposal of costumes and properties associated with the cancelled production. Her voice carried no trace of emotion, yet Alleyn observed that her hands trembled slightly as she consulted her notes. The Meridian Theatre will reopen within the month under new artistic direction, though it will take considerably longer to restore public confidence in our commitment to theatrical integrity. As the morning progressed and the practical details of institutional recovery were addressed, with the same efficiency that had once served to mount theatrical productions, Alleyn reflected on the curious transformation that had overtaken the elegant world of West End theatre. The conspiracy that had claimed Thomas Marlowe and Lady Cordelia Ashworth had been motivated by the desire to protect artistic reputations and cultural institutions from the scandal of systematic fraud, yet its exposure had achieved a different kind of protection, the harsh but necessary cleansing that could only come through acknowledgement of truth, however painful its revelation might prove. Dame Millicent rose from her dressing table with movements that suggested the weight of decades pressing upon her shoulders, her magnificent bearing intact, yet somehow transformed by the knowledge that her career had concluded not in planned triumph, but in unexpected tragedy. Inspector, I wish to express my gratitude for your discretion in handling matters that could easily have been sensationalized by less thoughtful investigators, she said, her voice carrying the formal courtesy that had marked her professional relationships throughout her distinguished career. Dr. Pembroke's actions were inexcusable, yet they were motivated by a devotion that, however misguided, deserves to be understood rather than merely condemned. The white carnations on her dressing table had begun to release their fragrance into the warming air, their presence serving as a reminder that beauty could emerge even from the most tragic circumstances. The dressing room, which had witnessed so many preparations for performances that would now never take place, seemed to echo with the ghost of applause that had marked Dame Millicent's greatest triumphs.